BBoy. BBoy is one of the oldest rigs. Now, when you open up BBoy, it looks like he's covered in hairy nerves, right? But those are just the joints. The scale of the joints are just really, really big. So they're not important for us to animate. In the show menu, what I'll usually do before I start animating is I'll start by looking at the show menu and I'll turn everything off except what I need. I'll need NURBS curves to control the rig. I'll need to see polygons. It's also very common, especially with more sophisticated rigs, that they will use NURBS surfaces as well. A lot of times things on the face, like the eyeballs, the tongue, could be different parts of the character's geo, could also be NURBS surfaces. So those need to be turned on. I'm going to need cameras, image planes, and I'll probably use the grease pencil to take notes and motion trails. So I just go through all the things that I'm going to need and just check those and just turn everything else off because I just don't want the risk of selecting something I'm not supposed to. Okay. Then I'm going to go to my filters and I'm going to turn everything off except for curves so that now when I look at the rig, right, I can animate. Okay. And I'm only going to select the character's controls. I'm not going to select geo. I'm not going to select anything I'm not supposed to. You know, some important things to look at with the rig. So with BBoy here, I think BBoy is so simple. It's set up the way that we want to animate. The way that we want to animate the character's arms is with something called FK, or forward kinematics. So forward kinematics means that it works just like our bodies do. It works from the shoulder to the elbow to the wrist. Okay. The advantage of that is it will give you arcs for free. You work on swinging the arm. You're basically using one joint at the top of the chain and you get the arm swing for free. Okay. So FK, that's the setting. Now this rig is so simple that it only has FK. It doesn't have a switch. We'll look at more advanced ones. On BBoy's hip control, you can see, again, ignore all the RenderMan stuff. Very simple. Just translate, rotate. That's it. There's not too many options. If you go to the wrist control here, you can see that this actually doesn't control directly the rotation of the wrist. What this does is it gives you a bunch of channels over here, which I can barely see. Where are they? There we go. Twist. So I can twist the wrist here. I can make the wrist go up or down. I can make it go side to side. And I can go to the index finger and roll that open or closed. I can spread the finger. So they usually have a bunch of channel box items, right? So to control the hand, they don't have individual controls. What you would have to do, get my filters back on, is you'd have to go here, go to the channel box, and then animate those attributes. So you can see that has everything to do with the fingers and also the wrist angle. So the arms are FK. They work from the shoulder down. The feet, when you're doing a walk, is the opposite. It's something called IK, or inverse kinematics. And the way that inverse kinematics works is that you're picking up the foot, and there's a little program that's called an IK solver, and it's figuring out where the knee is going to go. So this is really important when you need something to stay in one spot, like the feet when they're on the ground. So that means that when I take the hips and move them down, right, the feet stay there. So when we're doing a walk, we have to make sure that the legs are set up to be an IK so that we can pick up the foot and move it around. Okay. Anytime there's an IK system being used, there's usually something called a pole vector, which lets you control the knee. And we've already seen this before. If you remember the lamp rig that we used in term 1, there was a little control for the neck, right? The little neck elbow that we could use to angle that around. So it was the same system. It was an IK head in that case, but this is an IK foot. Now, the foot control usually, in addition to just translate and rotate, there's usually channels that you can use. And here again, I apologize, all this RenderMan stuff is just nonsense. It's not important. You probably don't see it, but it's this thing. I love this typo. It's supposed to be heel toe, but the right foot is named heel toe and the left one is called hell toe. Right? But they do the same thing. So what this does is it rocks the foot back and forth, and that gives you the pivot points that you need to animate. So why would they make these pivot points? Well, I'll show you. If I take the foot and rotate it, right, what will usually happen is the foot will go through the floor, especially the heel, right? This rig doesn't have an ideal pivot point. Usually for a foot control, the pivot point is in the ankle. So if I could change the pivot, I would love to put the pivot here, right, at the ankle, but I can't because this is rigged and that's where the pivot point is. So it's not the best place in the world for a pivot, but this channel box slider here is really good because then you can anchor the foot on the heel or on the ball of the foot and get some nice poses. It's really tough to do that manually because if I rotate the foot forward and then I try and lift it up, now I have to do 3 or 4 operations and use multiple channels to get a pose, which is going to be harder to clean up. If I have something that's simpler, then I'll use that. So if I can just use one thing, I'll animate that. So the general rule is when the foot is on the ground, use these options. Use the heel pivots, the toe pivots, the ball pivots, because those will help you. They will have a pivot point that helps you. They won't fight. They won't rotate under or above the ground. But as soon as the foot is in the air, then I wouldn't use this. I could use this, right, to angle the foot like this, and then I could use this to flatten it back out. And now what happens is I have the 2 channels are fighting each other. That rotation from the ankle is now fighting the rotation on the heel toe. So again, the idea is simplicity. Say, well, when I'm in the air, I'm not going to use this channel box thing. I'm just going to use this. And this makes a lot of sense. I can just pick the foot up, have it go up, have it angle forward, come in for a landing, right? It all makes sense. Whenever you're making contact with the ground, then it's better to use this and say, well, if I want this to land, I'm going to use that. That's going to be my landing pose. I'm going to make sure that that's the pose. When I hit the ground, the control itself is flat. It's not rotated. And I'm using the channel box here. But as soon as it's in the air, then I will turn those off and I'll just use a rotation just because that makes life a little simpler. You know, bucket. So the second group, group B, bucket is set up to work with IK in the arm. So we have to fix this. And you can see this is going to be a problem if you want to animate anything rotating. The problem is that if I want to rotate this, I don't get an arc for free. I set a key over here, right? And then I'll set a key over here, right? Say, okay, there's the front position, there's the back position. And what the computer does in the middle is a straight line. So what you get are elbows that kind of fold out and do all sorts of odd things. So IK is not a very good way to animate the arms for a walk, right? Because the arms are swinging freely. They don't need to be pinned in place. And it will tend to move things in straight lines, which we don't see in nature. So we need those arcs. So how do we fix that? Let me just delete the keys on this. And the switch is something every rig has in a slightly different spot. You have to find out where the switch is. In this rig, it's on these little mitten icons that are at the wrist. And there is IKFK blend. It's usually called some sort of an IKFK switch, a blend, toggle, whatever. And there's usually an option somewhere to slide it from 0 to 1 and whatever the options are, or 0 to 10. And it's either it's FK or it's IK. So this is 1. So I'm going to set that to 0 and then see what I get. And there we go. Now I have, there we go, a shoulder control. I have an elbow control, right here. It's a little bit off from the actual joint, and then a wrist control. So this is what we would use to animate. With bucket, do take care with the head. It can fly right away from the body. Right? That's the nice thing about rigs like this. So if you want to have some fun, you can take the neck, you can take the head, and it can just run completely away from the body if you want. Okay. And that's really fun, but it can kind of terrify people. There's a limited amount of movement you can do on the mouth. And I think there might even be some stuff here for the eyes. Yeah. You can do a little bit of, squash and stretch on the head, and there's blinks, right? But we don't need to worry about those, right? We're not doing any performance, just if you want to tinker around and play with the rig. The foot has similar kinds of things, right? We got like a heel pivot. So you can see that just pivots the heel up. There's a ball pivot, a toe pivot, and you tend to use a combination of these when you're making your poses, right? Just like the other rig, I would work the same way. Up in the air, don't use the pivots. When I'm on the ground, then I would use the pivots, okay? And we've also got one slight difference is with this rig, there's no controls for the knees. What they have instead is a twist. So if you go here for leg twist, that's what you would use to angle the knees, okay? With this rig, they actually have controls out there that would do that. But with bucket, you would just have to find a channel right there. Now for the fingers, again, if you go to the little mitten controls here where we had the switch for the IKFK, there's things here to like curl the fingers, you know, twist the fingers, you can pose them. We just want to be able to pose the character into like a neutral position, right? So it's kind of like a big mitten hand, not a lot of detail. Now with both rigs, I didn't mention this here. There's like a shoulder and there's also a clavicle, right? So this will roll the shoulders up or down and it may change the arm. The droid rig, I think this one, the biggest issue with the droid rig is the way the spine behaves. The spine does some pretty odd stuff. So we have this main control that moves the entire spine, and then there's a secondary control. So you see, this is dangerous. With this control, you don't want to translate it because it will actually come off of the rig. And you want to use this to swivel, right? But this doesn't move the hips, right? It only moves the upper body. So you can see a little bit of geo crashing can happen when you're doing that. So that can be a bit frustrating. So here, if I wanted to twist the hips, I'd have to use the big control. If I wanted to just twist the upper trunk, I would use this one. Okay, so there's a slight little difference in those rigs. And then there's also this little yellow control here. And this one will let you move the hip, but leave the torso alone, right? So you got 3 different options here. For a walk cycle, this is what I would like to use. I would like to use this because this way I can adjust the hips independently. And then I can go here and I can adjust the chest independently as well as the abdomen, right? So I've got like 2 controls I can work with. And that keeps everything separated. So if someone tells me the hips are moving too much, could you please tone that down? Then it won't affect the upper body. So when I move the hip, it moves the entire upper body. So what you have to do is you have to kind of get the level of rotation on the hip that you want first, and then work your way up the chain. Because if someone says it's great, but can you tone down the hips, it will change how much the chest rotates and how far the arms rotate. So it's a bigger edit because you don't have these isolated controls, right? And Bucket has the same issue, right? You twist the hip, it twists the entire upper body as well. But with this rig, you have some choice, okay? So my suggestion would be use this yellow control here to twist the hips. And you can do the salsa as well, right? Getting the hip twist. And then you can use this control to rotate the entire upper body or use the chest. Now, if you use the chest too much, you can see what happens to some of the geometry here. It moves and flexes, but it might start to feel a little bit like gum. It won't feel like solid metal anymore. So my advice would be I use this very sparingly, and probably I would just use this more than anything because that feels more like a robot. Okay. But you can experiment and see what you can get away with. The arms are already set up in FK. Great. If you wanted to switch that, that's that little cube down here. And that would give you the IKFK switch. You have controls here on the wrist. And this rig, you have individual controls for the fingers, right? So you can go in and adjust the fingers individually as opposed to working in the channel box. All right. No need to give this thing a blaster. You can just hide this, just put it under the floor or off screen, right? Don't have the droid walking around with the gun because then we're not doing a full walk. It's constrained a little bit and I don't want it to be complicated for you. Okay. So that's the droid. How are the feet? The feet are a little different, I think. What we got here? Yeah, we got a foot roll, right? So you can rock the foot back and forth. There's also, you can see there's a little thing called the toe brake. So what that means is that when it gets to 45 degrees, the toe roll will fire. So that means that keep going. And as soon as I get to 45 degrees, right, then right there, boom, the toe starts to fire. So you may not like that. You may say, well, I want that to fire sooner. So let's make it like 35. Then when I go to the foot roll, it's going to use the toe a little sooner. So it really depends how much pinching you're comfortable with. So this rig, again, you got a lot more choices. There's also an individual control here for a foot flap. So this doesn't give you a pivot, but what you could do is if you were lifting the foot in the air and rotating it, you could add a little bit of drag, right? So you could adjust this manually, or if you wanted to have the toe kind of be flappy like a clown foot, you could do that. Okay, everything else is pretty much the same. There's also Is that a clavicle? Yep. So we have, oh, what does this even do? Oh, auto rotate. I see. That is our shoulder rotation. And this one is the arm, right? So that all works together. But that doesn't seem like there's a big clavicle. You can't really go and rotate the shoulders because, again, it's a droid. Okay, good. Now on to this rig here. Hit 6. Then we can see the textures. Now with this rig, if you go over to the display layers, there is a layer here for cloth. So turn that off. That way we don't have to worry about all the drapery and having to animate that stuff. So just take off that layer of clothing so that it's much simpler, easier to work with. Okay. Now the arm, it looks like it's set to be, yeah, that's IK. We don't want that. So we go to the circles above there, go look for the switch, and it's not there. So where would the switch be? Check the hips. Is there any switch there? Nope. How about here? Ah, there's the IKFK blends. So again, some rigs do it differently. Some put them right on the hands, some put on the main control. So here, if I want to change the arms, I can hit control and select both of them, set those both to 1. And now what I have is the FK arms. And we can put those down. There's also shoulder controls. So you can stretch the shoulders up, right? You can shrug the shoulders, move them forward and back. And with this rig, there's also these deformers. Please don't use these, okay? These are nice for shaping to kind of sculpt the geometry a little bit so it looks less like a tube and more like an arm, but there's no reason for you to use them, okay? They're fun to have to do smear frames, but for a walk, we're basically just doing forward, back, forward, back. Okay, good. Now the spine. So there's this control here, yeah. Anything on the rig that can translate on the spine is going to deform very weirdly. So these are nice to have like little tweaks, but you can see the kind of trouble I'm going to get into, right, with using this control. So this kind of control I wouldn't use.
Is it possible to switch in between IK and FK for different keyframes?
Yes, but what happens is it will basically go back to the T-pose.
Okay,
Right. So this is what an animator, the bane of an animator's existence is switching between IK and FK because sometimes you have to. So basically, when you look at a rig, it has 3 sets of limbs. It has the skeleton, which is there to bind the geometry. So that means that you've taken the geometry and bound it to a bone, right? So that's just the bind skeleton. Then there's the control skeletons, and there's 2 of them. There's the IK control skeleton and the FK control skeleton. So with any rig, and you'll learn this in rigging class, right, is you'll discover that, okay, it's quite complex and you're switching these different systems on and off, and everything is usually anchored back to the bind pose, which is the T pose. So what usually happens, I'm in IK and I've got this nice pose. I want to go to FK. I go back to the T pose. I have to kind of get it close and try to match them. And that's always very frustrating. So we always try and find places where you're moving very big spacing so that it's harder to see the switch. Okay, when it's very subtle, then you have to match things very closely. It's incredibly annoying. So, you have to kind of like, where am I going to do the switch?
Right.
More about that later. Luckily for the walk, we're not going to be switching in and out of IK and FK. We're just setting it up and then we're going to animate.